while Night Watch is fiction, it's just so deeply rooted in the historical realities of post-Civil War West Virginia that it's really like taking a step back in time. We're talking about a world that's grappling with this new identity, the scars of conflict still fresh.
I see.
And right at the heart of it all is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, later known as Weston State Hospital.
Now, what's fascinating to me here is how Phillips uses the asylum to explore not just the era's understanding of mental health, but also these broader themes of survival, resilience, and the search for belonging.
Exactly. It's not just about the asylum itself, but all the lives that intersect within those walls. Like, take ConaLee, for instance. She's only 16 when she's forced to bring her ailing mother to the asylum. Can you imagine being that young, facing such a desperate situation? And then, to make matters worse,
oh gosh,
she has to adopt a false identity just to stay close to her mother.
Wow.
All while trying to escape the shadow of this abusive father.
That journey to the asylum, you know, is so powerfully written. It's not just a physical journey, but an emotional one too. We see ConaLee's vulnerability, her resourcefulness,
Absolutely.
and all the subtle ways Phillips conveys the trauma that she carries with her.
Yeah.
Even the way the novel is structured with those fragmented pieces of time and memory.
Right.
It's almost as if we're experiencing the world through ConaLee's eyes.
It's like Phillips is inviting us to piece together this puzzle alongside ConaLee. And one of the most intriguing pieces is this mysterious figure, Dearblah, an Irish healer connected to ConaLee's past. We know bits and pieces about her, her resourcefulness, her knowledge of herbal remedies, even her connection to enslaved people. But so much about her remains kind of shrouded in mystery.
And that's deliberate, you know? Phillips is not giving us all the answers right away.
Right.
She wants us to experience that same sense of discovery, that same need to unearth the hidden truths that drive these characters.
Okay.
Talk about O'Shea, the Night Watch. He's the one who first brings ConaLee and her mother to the asylum.
He's such a striking figure as this imposing presence with a shrouded past, maybe a war injury, and there's this air of quiet competence about him.
Absolutely.
That just sets him apart.
O'Shea represents a different kind of authority. He's not a doctor, but his experience, his intuition, it gives him a certain power within the asylum. And it contrasts with Dr. Story, the asylum superintendent, who embodies a more formal, institutional kind of authority.
It's interesting to think about how Phillips uses these two characters to explore the whole concept of moral treatment.
Oh, absolutely.
Which was really a big deal in 19th century asylums.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, a leading figure in this movement, believed in humane care, purposeful activity, social interaction.
Right.
It was all about creating this therapeutic environment.
What's really striking is how Kirkbride emphasized the importance of qualified staff. I mean, he believed that even the example that was set by staff could impact patients, which makes you think about the influence of figures like O'Shea and even Mrs. Hexam, the head cook.
Mrs. Hexam, she's a force of nature.
Yeah.
Creating her own little family within the asylum.
She is.
It makes you wonder how much of moral treatment was actually about these formal principles versus those more intuitive, almost instinctive acts of care.
That's a great point. And it gets to the heart of what makes Night Watch so compelling. It's not just a historical novel. It's this exploration of human nature, of how we find connection and meaning in the most unlikely of places.
Absolutely. And that search for connection is something we can all relate to even today.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't you say?
Totally. Thinking about those connections within the asylum, it really strikes me how Phillips uses the setting itself to kind of heighten the character's sense of vulnerability.
Yeah.
West Virginia, you know, freshly formed after the Civil War, it's like a character in its own right, really grappling with its own identity. The wounds of conflict so raw.
It's like the ground is still shifting under their feet, literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
And you can see how that impacts everybody, from ConaLee and her mother to the patients in the asylum.
Exactly. And within that instability, it's fascinating how Phillips kind of subverts those traditional power structures. We talked about O'Shea and Dr. Story. But there's also Mrs. Hexam, the head cook. She may not have an official title, but she wields this incredible influence, almost like she's running this parallel system in the asylum.
I was so struck by that. You have Dr. Story representing the official authority and Mrs. Hexam with her own rules. It made me think about how sometimes the most powerful people aren't the ones with the fancy titles.
Absolutely. And the way Phillips portrays Mrs. Hexam, it's not just about power. It's about protection. She sees that vulnerability of the patient, and she creates this informal family within the asylum, offering a sense of belonging and safety that the institution can't provide.
Which makes you think about moral treatment in a whole new light. It's not just about these lofty ideals, it's those everyday acts of care, the ways we look out for each other, even in really tough situations.
Exactly. And that's really where Night Watch goes beyond a simple historical novel. It becomes this exploration of what it means to be human, how we find connection and meaning when the world feels chaotic and uncaring.
Speaking of chaos, I'm really fascinated by how Phillips uses that fragmented narrative structure
Yes.
to mirror the characters' own fractured experiences. We're piecing together this mosaic, right?
Yeah.
Trying to make sense of their stories through glimpses and pieces of memory.
It's brilliant, really, and it works on all these different levels. On the one hand, it reflects the trauma and confusion that so many of these characters are dealing with. And on the other hand, it invites us, the readers, to be active participants in the story. We're not just passively consuming the information, we're actively piecing together the puzzle alongside the characters.
And that puzzle includes some pretty dark pieces. Phillips doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of that time. The violence, the exploitation, the ways in which society's most vulnerable members were so often left to fend for themselves.
Absolutely, and yet amidst all that darkness, there's also this incredible resilience. Take ConaLee, for instance. She's been through so much.
She has.
But she never gives up. She's always adapting, finding ways to survive, to protect those she cares about.
That reminds me of the relationship between ConaLee and Weed, that young boy she meets in the asylum. They come from such different backgrounds,
Right.
but they find this incredible connection.
It's a beautiful example of how human connection can thrive in the most unexpected places. And it really speaks to a larger theme in the novel, this idea that home isn't just a place,
Right.
but a sense of belonging, this feeling of safety and acceptance.
And for so many of these characters, that sense of home is so elusive. They're searching, they're moving, always trying to find their place in this world that just feels constantly in flux.
Yeah, and that search is
Yeah.
often fraught with danger. The Civil War, with its legacy of violence and division, it casts such a long shadow over the entire book.
Yeah.
And it's not just a backdrop, it's this force that shapes their identities, their relationships, their understanding of the world.
It's like the war has left these invisible scars, right? And they continue to impact the characters long after the fighting is over.
Exactly, and it's through those scars, those vulnerabilities, that Phillips really explores those complexities of the human experience. She's not giving us easy answers or simple solutions. Instead, she's inviting us to confront that darkness, to acknowledge the pain, and ultimately to find hope and meaning amidst all of it.
And that hope often comes from these really unexpected sources, right? Like bond between O'Shea and Dr. Story.
Yeah.
Or the fierce protectiveness of Mrs. Hexam. It's like Phillips is showing us that even in the most broken system, human connection can still thrive.
Absolutely. And that connection, it's messy, complicated, it's full of contradictions, but it's also what makes us human.
Right.
It's what allows us to survive, to heal, to find meaning when the world feels overwhelming.
You know, one thing that really struck me about Night Watch was how Phillips uses symbolism to reinforce these themes. ConaLee's constant movement, from that river journey to her time at the asylum.
Right.
It's like she's always searching for solid ground, but the ground is always shifting beneath her feet.
That's a great observation. And it connects to that larger theme of instability that runs through the whole book. That newly formed West Virginia, those fractured memories of the characters, the dilapidated state of the asylum. It's all part of this overarching sense of unease and uncertainty that really permeates the story.
And yet, amidst all that uncertainty, there are those moments of beauty.
Absolutely.
Of grace. Of human connection that offer that glimmer of hope.
Exactly, and it's those moments, those little glimmers of hope that stay with us long after we've finished reading. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure, that love and compassion can still flourish, and that the search for belonging is a journey worth taking, no matter how challenging it may be. And speaking of those glimmers of hope, I think it's worth going back to the idea of moral treatment. And how Phillips portrays it in Night Watch. Because on the surface, you have these lofty ideals about humane care and therapeutic environments.
Like all those principles laid out by Kirkbride, fresh air, purposeful activity, the importance of qualified staff. But then you see how all that plays out in the reality of the asylum.
Yeah.
With its limited resources, the overcrowding, and that ever-present shadow of stigma.
And what's interesting is how Phillips doesn't shy away from those complexities. She shows us the limitations of moral treatment.
Right.
But she also highlights the ways in which these acts of kindness and compassion can make a difference, a real difference in the lives of the patients.
Like the way O'Shea interacts with ConaLee and her mother. He's not a doctor.
Right.
He doesn't have any formal training in mental health care. But there's this innate empathy in him, this understanding of their vulnerability.
Exactly. And it's not just about providing physical care. It's about recognizing their humanity, their dignity. Even in the midst of all their suffering, he sees them. He listens to them. And that simple act is so powerful.
It makes you realize that moral treatment isn't just about systems and structures. It's about human connection, treating each other with respect and compassion, regardless of our circumstances.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from Night Watch. It's this reminder that even in the most broken systems, human kindness can still prevail.
One thing that really struck me about the novel was how Phillips connects those acts of kindness to the larger themes of healing and recovery.
Right.
Because for so many of these characters, the trauma they've experienced goes way beyond the walls of the asylum.
Right, especially with the legacy of the Civil War. It's not just some event in the past. It's this wound that continues to shape their identities, their relationships, long after the fighting has ended.
Like, think about ConaLee's struggle to come to terms with her father's Confederate sympathies. It's like that history is still haunting her.
Right.
Shaping her understanding of the world, even her sense of self.
And that's where that fragmented narrative structure becomes so powerful. Because it's not just about ConaLee's experience.
Right.
It's about the way trauma can fragment our memories, our sense of time, even our understanding of who we are.
It's like Phillips is inviting us to experience that fragmentation right alongside them, to piece together those broken memories, the history, as we journey through the novel.
And in a way, that becomes a metaphor for healing. Because it's only by confronting the past, by acknowledging those broken pieces, that we can begin to make sense of our present and move forward.
That's a powerful insight. It makes me think about the ending of the novel, when ConaLee finally buys a house in Weston. It's not just a physical home.
Right.
It's a symbol of her reclaiming her agency, creating a space for herself and the people she cares for.
Exactly. It's this image of hope and renewal, a testament to the human capacity for resilience.
I think we're left with this pretty profound question. How do we find our own sense of home, of belonging, in a world that can often feel fragmented and so uncertain?
It's such a relevant question, especially now.
Yeah.
But I think the characters in Phillips' book kind of offer a roadmap, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, there's always that glimmer of light, that possibility for healing, for connection, for finding our way back to ourselves and to each other.
And maybe, just maybe, by embracing those glimmers of light, by acknowledging our shared humanity, by offering each other kindness and compassion, we can begin to create a world where everyone has a chance to find their home.